Hello, in this video we're going to talk about amniotic fluid. So first up, what is its purpose? Well, it's got two big ones, one being creating a sterile environment. So we want a clean area where this baby can grow and not worry about catching any type of infections. And then it needs protection. So it's going to provide a little bit of a cushion and keep it from bouncing around, hitting anything hard that it's not supposed to be hitting. Next up, what's in it? So it's got a lot of different things in it, so we're just going to make a little list. We have electrolytes, we have amino acids, we've got different proteins, we have our lipids and carbs. We got some other stuff that comes off the baby. So these are things like fetal lung fluid, and even some cells, some fetal cells that we can actually take that out and test for depending on a couple things and what we wanted to see. One of those, in terms of our cells, is called the fetal protein. So alpha fetal protein. We can test this, and if it is elevated, it's a pretty good indication that we have a neural tube defect. And if it is decreased, it gives us a suspicion, or we can use for a diagnosis of Down syndrome. So we look at all those type of things. Now, so the meat of this one is where does it come from? Where does it go? So it is a balancing act between two forces. We have production and reabsorption. With our production, it's coming from our mom, so it is maternally derived water. And it comes from a couple forces that are acting on that water, one of them being osmotic, and the other being hydrostatic. And the baby's going to rely on mom to make some of this fluid, at least initially, until it's able to kickstart its own production. Now, where is most of this production coming from for the baby? Well, where did I go? I have a yellow there. Okay. A lot of it is coming from urine. So, baby is just floating around in that fluid, which is composed of a lot of its own urine. And what happens with it? Well, the infant needs to reabsorb it. So we have something going on, which is going to be called fetal swallowing. When the infant's in there, so it's not just floating around doing nothing all day. It's kicking, it's doing some things, it's working on practicing breathing. It's swallowing this fluid, it's running it through its intestinal tract, so it can be reabsorbed. So we got GI reabsorption. And then it's going to go back to the baby. Baby's going to urinate it back out, and it's just continually going on that process. It's just going to keep going and going until baby grows big enough and we're ready for the baby to come out. Now, a couple things that are a little different to know about is, so the primary site is our GI tract. That's where most of it's going to be absorbed. But before 25 weeks, the primary site is the skin. So the skin is not keratinized. So most of that water is going to be absorbed through the skin before 25 weeks gestation. After that, though, it's going to be mostly absorbed through the GI tract. Now, looking at a couple things. So it's a balancing act. So of course we have two sides. We can have too little, just put less, or we can have too much. We have to continually balance those things based on what's going on with our baby. So for both of these, idiopathic is a big one. So we don't know why, but for whatever reason, it just is. And I know with the polyhydramnios, that's about anywhere from 50 to 60% of the cases. So let's look up here at our oligo. So what can cause problems here? Well, that's going to be underproduction. And that's going to be things like gastro or genourinary problems. So let's draw our kidneys, come down to our bladder. So with our kidneys, if we have agenesis, if we have dysplasia, so it didn't develop, and on our bladder end of things, if we have an outlet obstruction, so they're just unable to get that urine out. So obstruction. Another one that can go on, so we didn't produce enough. Our other one is leak. So loss or leak. And these are, big one here is just your premature rupture of membrane, so PROM. And depending on the time that this happens, it can cause some problems. So if it happens early in gestation, like less than 18 weeks, you can develop some pulmonary hyperplasia and some other problems. But let's look now at our polyhydramnios. So we have too much. Yeah. Big one is just that idiopathic for both of these. We don't know why, but it happens to be that way. For too much is decreased absorption. So absorption. So for somewhere in this process of fetal swallowing and GI reabsorption, something is going wrong and it's not able to absorb that fluid. That can be caused by a couple different things. So let's just connect these a little bit. So problems here. So fetal swallowing. So just think about our GI tract where we get all the way at the top. So we have things like TE fistulas or atresia. Or TE or atresia, esophageal atresia. So anything up there that's going to cause problem swallowing. Then we have our GI problems like your other atresias, duodenal atresia is a good one. So anything along that abdominal tract that's going to cause some type of an obstruction, obstruction, where it's not going to be able to absorb. And our last one is increased production. This can be caused by a few things. So multiples, having more than one baby. So you have a couple babies in there, they're peeing, they're filling that sac up, there's not a lot of space for it. So we got to watch out for that. Another good one is maternal diabetes is listed as a possible cause. So we have a blue circle for diabetes. So anything like that can cause any of those problems. And then lastly, we're making a different problem. Kind of overlaps all of them, but congenital. So any congenital or specific congenital anomalies can cause problems either up here, down here, just depending specifically on what it is. All right, now we've got too little, we got too much, it can cause some specific problems. So let's look at our balancing act. So it's not like super important to know the exact numbers, but somewhere between less than 400 and greater than 2 liters. So our balancing act is we want to be somewhere right here in the middle. The baby's going to be continually drinking that fluid, swallowing it, reabsorbing it, producing it, and certain pathological process and physiological processes are going to cause these two to not line up and get out of whack for whatever reason. It's going to cause some problems. So let's look first at our oligo. So I'm going to stretch this out and give myself a little bit more room. Oops. I need it down here as well. So we're stretching out. neck down. So when we have too little amniotic fluid, so we don't have enough fluid in there for this baby. The big problem is there's not enough space for growth. So if you think about plants, because it's the same idea with plants, is they're going to grow to whatever container they're in. If the container is small, it's going to be small. If it's big, it'll be bigger. If it's specially shaped, it'll be uniquely shaped. So this can cause a couple problems. We don't have enough space for growth later in pregnancy. This is where we're going to get our developmental congenital dysplasia, God, I can't even think of it. It's one of those being your hip dysplasia. This also can be your club foot. So any of those skeletal anomalies that are going to be caused by something being squished up against that uterine wall because there's not enough room for it to grow. So it's going to grow to what it's in. And if it happens to be not enough room, it's going to be a little bit deformed. And if we're hitting that in a little earlier in pregnancy, say 16 to 18 weeks, is where we're going to get our hypoplastic lungs. Now the baby needs that fluid. It needs to be able to practice breathing, moving the diaphragm. If there's not enough of that fluid floating around, which it's fetal lung fluid, which is a little different than your amniotic fluid, but that's its own topic. But if there's not enough of that, it can cause some problems. The lungs aren't going to be able to develop. Baby won't be able to survive without lungs, so we can understand that. Now, you got to know about our treatments for this. Well, there are a couple. Easiest one, if it's usually later in pregnancy, we just do hydration. So tell mom to drink a little bit more water. Check for any signs of dehydration with her. Make sure that everything's looking good with her. There's another one that we can do called an amniofusion. This is not a routine thing they're going to do because it has a lot of risks. It's pretty risky to do it, so we're not going to do it unless there's an absolute indication that they'll need to. Now, in terms of our space for growth, our oligo, there is one disorder we're going to make sure we remember about this called Potter syndrome. With our Potter syndrome, the big problem with that is kidney failure. So the baby is not able to produce that urine. It's not able to make its amniotic fluid. It ends up not developing lungs because of that, and it's a fatal problem for them. So moving down, we've got our polyhydramnios. So what happens when we have too much of this fluid? Well, a couple things that can happen. If there's too much room in there for the baby, it ends up being breech. So it can flip, not be in the appropriate position for delivery. Another one is cord prolapse. So there may be so much fluid in there that it's actually pushing the cord out, so it might like pop out, or baby might get compressed up against it. So watch out for that one. And then abrupto placento. So just an abruption of the placenta. So there's too much pressure in that uterine area and the placenta becomes unattached. And what can we do for it? So our treatment. There is what's called a reductive amniocentesis. Or, they're going to put a big needle in there. They're going to drain some of that fluid. And hopefully that's going to keep that down. But again, it comes with some problems. So we're going to reserve this for only symptomatic moms. So if there's polyhydramnios, but mom's not having any problems, any issues, complications, anything like that, we'll just deal with it. We don't need to address it because the risks of actually going in there and trying to do anything with it would be more than the benefit. Now with both of these, so if we have too little or too much, so let's look at our amniotic cavity. So if we have too little, it's going to get compressed. And if we get too much, it's going to stretch outwards. Now, if it's going either of these directions, there's the chance that it could rupture. So big thing we're going to watch out for is premature rupture of membranes, PROM. And when we have that occur, the fluid's leaking, the sac's not intact, eventually we'll probably have to deliver the baby, so it's not ready. Preterm labor. And if that sac, amniotic sac ruptures, we'll have bands of that amnion floating around, and we can get what's called the amniotic band syndrome. So with those bands that we have floating around, they can get entangled in the baby, around fingers, arms. Upper arms are usually more common than lower, but it gets tangled. The limbs get tangled in these strands of amnion, and it can strangulate the extremities. So they can actually get a full or partial amputation in uterine, and that's just not something we want to happen. So with our amniotic fluid, I say it's there to provide a sterile environment and protect the baby. It's composed of a lot of different fluids. It comes from the mom initially, then the baby's going to start producing their own through their urine. Its amount of production and reabsorption, mainly it's going to be through fetal swallowing. After 25 weeks, before that, it's going to be through the skin. And if we have too little fluid, that can cause some problems with decreased space for growth, like lung hypoplasia and skeletal deformities. If we have too much, there's a risk for cord prolapse, breach, and with both of them, there's the risk for PROM, preterm labor, and amniotic band syndrome.